The 13 colonies started to rebel openly against Parliament's laws. Not rebel as in a military fight, but rebel as in refuse to obey laws, protest against the laws, that sort of thing. It didn't become actual physical fighting until the 1770s. But in terms of protest and not complying with the laws and boycotting British goods, all that starts at the 1760s. And the reasons that they started to have problems in the 1760s are threefold. First, the French and Indian War, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, ended in 1763. And that's a major catalyst for the troubles between the colonies and Great Britain. Second, more importantly, by the 1760s, the colonists and the British, who now begin to see themselves as different people for the first time in a long time, the colonists and the British have very different ideas about government, what governments are for, how they run, where they get their authority, that sort of thing, what they can do. And third, the British attempted to assert their control over the colonies, and that backfired. Right? The more they tried to assert their control, the more rebellious the colonists became, the Americans. So I'll start very briefly with the French and Indian War. And I'm not going to talk, it's a fascinating war, a fascinating event, but I'm not going to talk about it in anything like the detail that it deserves. I'm just going to focus on a few aspects of it that are important for understanding the American Revolution 12 years or so later. So we call it in America the French and Indian War, and we date it from roughly 1754 to 1763. In Europe, they call it the 7 Years' War, and they date it from 1756 to 1763. And the reason there's a discrepancy there is the war that became the 7 Years' War in Europe started here in America. It started with disputes between the French and the British over the Ohio River Valley. So out here you see Ohio on the kind of western portion of this map. And this is the Ohio River down here. So the British and the French were both building forts in the river valley. You can see the French forts in blue and the British in red. And they were contesting ownership of the valley. And at one point, around 1754, a very young Virginian, George Washington, who was about 22, was sent to the valley and told, basically, build a fort and tell the French, who were already building what was going to be Fort Duquesne, you can see here, tell them to leave. Tell them they're on British land, this is Virginia, and they need to go away. Washington did, and they didn't leave, and they didn't go away. And Washington attacked, and they fought back, and Washington's force ended up being defeated and having to scurry back to Virginia. But war was on, sparked by a contest to see who could dominate the interior of North America. Well, the war lasted, like I said, for several years, eventually spreading all over the world, becoming a world war, in other words. And the important thing for us to know is that when it formally ended in 1763, the British were defeated, and the future of the North American continent was going to be changed permanently. Before I get to that, I want to take a moment to mention something that you may have heard of at some point during, high school or middle school or whatever. In 1754, so this is the very beginning of the conflict between France and Britain in North America. And it hasn't yet become a world war in Europe. In 1754, 7 of the colonies met in what they call the Albany Congress. That's in Albany, New York. And Benjamin Franklin was there. He was the most famous person in North America at the time. He was a celebrity by 18th century standards for his studies of electricity and things like that. Well, Franklin was there, and he proposed the Albany Plan. And in this plan, the colonies would elect delegates to a grand council that would oversee common defense, westward expansion, and Indian affairs. So basically, they would create a very, very limited government, right? The council would handle foreign policy so that the colonies could coordinate their efforts. And his idea was, we're now involved in a war against the French and their Indian allies, hence they called it the French and Indian War. If we could coordinate ourselves, instead of having Virginia fight one war, Massachusetts fight another war, Georgia fight another war, we could be safer and more secure and more effective. Well, his plan was rejected by everyone. It was rejected by the colonies because the colonial assemblies were unwilling to give up any of their power, even for a limited basis, like foreign policy to get through this war. And in addition to the colonial assemblies being unwilling to share power, Parliament didn't like the plan. Parliament in England thought, no, this could get out of hand if they start forming their own government. Who knows what they'll demand next, right? Independence or the right to tax themselves or who knows what. Interestingly, many years later, 20 years or so, 30 years or so later, reflecting back on this, Franklin thought that if his plan had succeeded and been accepted, there never would have been an American Revolution. And we would be like Canada today. We would be a part of the United Kingdom's Commonwealth, but with our own self-rule, our own internal affairs. And the reason he thought that was because if the Americans were coordinating their own defense and their own foreign policy, there would be no need to send British soldiers to America. And if there are no British soldiers, then there's no fights between them and colonists, like at the Boston Massacre that I'll get to in a few minutes. And all of the things that sparked a revolution would never have needed to happen. Who knows? But it's an interesting thought. The Treaty of Paris ended the war. And France was out of North America for good. Well, almost for good. There's a brief interlude in the late 1700s, early 1800s, but for the most part, for good. So France gave all of its territory west of the Mississippi River, as well as New Orleans, to Spain. So you see all this in yellow here? That had been claimed by France. Of course, mostly it was Indians who lived there. But they gave up their claim to Spain. All of the territory east of the Mississippi River, all of this in here, was claimed by France and given to Great Britain. So France just gives up its claim to a huge chunk of land in North America. And France was eliminated as a colonial power in North America. That will have huge ramifications. Here you can see the difference. Before the war, all the stuff in yellow is French. The kind of striped stuff is the border between France and Great Britain and what they've claimed, and this was some of the territory that was in dispute. But now, 9 years later, all of that is claimed by Great Britain, and then on the left by Spain, and France is just gone. So how does this relate to the American Revolution? Well, for 150 years, American colonists in North America had felt like they needed the protection of Great Britain. They needed British soldiers to protect them from the French, who were next door, so to speak. But now that the war was over and France was defeated and France was eliminated as a military power, a colonial power in North America, the American colonists thought, well, we don't need anybody looking out for us anymore, right? We don't need your protection, and that has ramifications. They don't need British troops to be stationed in their cities. They don't need to pay taxes to support these British troops, because why are they there? The French are gone. The war is over. Another aspect of all this is that during the war, there had been rising tensions between the British and American colonists. And one of the things that caused tensions to rise was that a lot of colonists smuggled goods to the French. They bought and sold, I don't know, tea, other goods to the French army, the French soldiers, French citizens throughout the war. And British attempts to stop that smuggling just created tension between the two sides. Another thing that created tension between the two sides is that the British thought that the Americans were not paying their fair share of taxes to support the defense of the colonies. So they fought this long war that at least initially was a war about North America and then became a world war. And they thought, well, we're paying all the cost of this. We're sending soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean, fighting the French, fighting Indians, and the American colonists who we were protecting don't seem to pay anything. In fact, they smuggle with the enemy during the war. So a lot of antagonism. And then last, during the war, during those 10 years or so, Americans and the British began to conceive of themselves as different people, and that's reflected in the language. So if you had gone 20 years back and you had asked Americans, who are they, right? They would have said Englishmen, right? If you had asked Thomas Jefferson in the 1750s, are you an American? He might not have even known what you were talking about, right? The term might have meant nothing to him. If it meant anything to him, it would have meant somebody who lives on the American continents. And he would have said, well, yeah, but so what? What does that mean? It'd be like asking you today, are you an Earthian? Well, I guess you are, but who cares? 20 years later, at some point by the 1760s, Americans began to call themselves Americans. So they're now linguistically distinguishing themselves from the British. I'll give you an example of that. A New Hampshire newspaper in 1764 talked about how proud American colonists were to be members of the United Kingdom and talked about the different groups in the United Kingdom and said, the spirited Englishman, the mountainous Welshman, the brave Scotchman and Irishman, and the loyal American may be firmly united as British brothers. So they didn't want separation yet. That would come pretty soon. But they were thinking themselves as a different people, right, with their own identity. Now, I mentioned one of the underlying causes of the revolution and the separation, the independence, is that the Americans and the British had different ideas about how the colonies should be governed. And underlying that, they had different interpretations of the British Constitution and the role of Parliament in the British Constitution. The British believed, and with maybe one or two wrinkles still believe even to this day, that Parliament was the supreme authority throughout the empire, and by definition, anything Parliament did was constitutional. In American colonies, they believed that the British Constitution recognized certain fundamental rights that not even Parliament could violate. So to put it in a nutshell, in the British scheme of things, Parliament, whatever Parliament says goes. That's the end of discussion. It's the ultimate authority. And Americans were thinking by the 1760s, no, there's some things not even Parliament can do. The word parliamentary sovereignty is the key to this. At the bottom, I have a phrase there, Parliament is supreme in the sense that no court can declare an act of Parliament unconstitutional. That might no longer be true. I try to follow British politics just a little bit, just for fun, out of curiosity. And a year or two ago, a British court did seem to declare an act of Parliament unconstitutional, and that was shocking. Some people thought that can't happen. That doesn't even make sense. But it seems to have happened, so maybe this is outdated now. Certainly in the 1700s, though, this was the way people thought. So the British believed in parliamentary sovereignty. This was the doctrine that Parliament had absolute legislative authority throughout Great Britain and its colonies. But the Americans were used to governing themselves, and they had come to believe that Parliament did not have absolute authority over them. One sign of that belief was the phrase, no taxation without representation. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So they thought, well, since we don't send representatives to Parliament, they can't tax us. That's one limit on their power, right? And they came to believe that Parliament had the authority to rule over international matters, matters that affected Great Britain and its colonies collectively, like foreign policy, right? Tariff laws, things like that. But Parliament did not have the right to rule over domestic matters in the colonies. The colonies would rule themselves. In 1770, Massachusetts said, this House has the same inherent rights in this province as the House of Commons in Great Britain. They believed they had the right to tax themselves, just as the House of Commons in Great Britain could tax the people there. By the 1770s, Americans like Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Adams were arguing that Parliament ruled over Great Britain only, and that colonies were ruled by their own legislatures, and that Britain and the American colonies were only connected by allegiance to the crown. We give you just a simple kind of explanation, visual of what I mean by that. So by the 1760s, you have in Massachusetts, one of the biggest of the colonies, you have an assembly, and it rules over the people of Massachusetts, right? In Virginia, you have the House of Burgesses, and it rules over the people of Virginia. And in Great Britain, you have Parliament, and it rules over the people of Great Britain. The difference is this. In England, they were saying Parliament also rules over you. So anything Parliament says that your little assemblies and houses disagree with, Parliament has the last word. Parliament is final. Parliament is sovereign. The Americans said, no. Some of them said, Parliament can rule over us in matters affecting the whole empire. So like trade, like war, but not in domestic matters. So it can't tax us here at home within the confines of our own state. Some of them, like Jefferson and Adams, even went so far by the 1770s to say, we all owe allegiance to the King of England, but Parliament has no authority to tell us in Virginia what to do any more than we have the authority to tell people in Great Britain what to do, right? So we're loyal to the same king, but that's the only tie that we have. That's what Jefferson was saying by the 1770s. Now, a fundamental factor in understanding the American ideas about government was the influence of John Locke. I mentioned him before, but he's very important, so I'll mention him again. So Americans have been heavily influenced by his idea that people have inalienable rights, and that means that your right to life, liberty, and property, which were the way that it was usually talked about in those days, cannot be taken from you justifiably. A tyrannical government can ignore them and oppress you, but it cannot justifiably take away your right to life, liberty, or property. Right? They were given to you by God, is how they usually explained it. Governments were formed to protect those inalienable rights. So the reason we all get together to form a government is because we know without a government, some bad actors among us will kill people, steal from people, abuse people. So the government is to protect our rights from, individual malactors, bad actors, or from other people, other governments that would kidnap us and, raid us and subject us to persecution and all that sort of thing. So the government is created to protect our rights. We grant some power over our lives to that government, but not absolute or arbitrary power. Right? And it can only exercise those powers which we have granted to it. Okay? And if it begins to exercise powers that we have not granted to it, if it begins to operate out of or beyond what we have consented, then it becomes arbitrary and unjustified, and we have the right to overthrow it or change it or whatever it may be. So this idea was commonplace in America by the 1760s and 1770s, and they considered it just as obvious as the air that you're breathing, that if they did not consent to be ruled by Parliament, then Parliament had no authority over them, justifiably. In Parliament, all of this kind of sounded like crazy nonsense. They thought, we make the laws, you obey the laws, that's all there is to it. Stop this consent talk garbage. Right? It's nonsense. Now, around 1763, the British decided that they needed to increase their control over the colonies. They needed to administer the colonies more from London instead of letting the colonists run their own affairs. And they needed to demand that the Americans start paying their fair share of the costs of administering the empire. This is King George III. He took the throne in 1760, and it was really his idea and his prime minister, a guy named George Grenville. They were the ones who believed this together and kind of hashed the plan to start being stricter, you might say, on the colonies. One of the first measures they took was the Proclamation of 1763. It attempted to prevent Americans from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the purpose of this was to avoid provoking wars with Indians. So effectively, it drew a line, an imaginary line, across the top of the Appalachians from what's Maine or Canada, I guess it would be today, all the way down to what's Georgia today, because Georgia was Spanish property. Florida was Spanish property. And it says to the Americans, you can't go west of that line. Now, Americans ignored the rule. They considered it an unjust infringement on their freedom. Many of them had already invested in lands west of the line, and so this threatened their investments. And many of them were just beginning to move westward, a gradual move westward that would last, 150 more years, eventually settling the whole continent. And so it was an ineffective rule, and it began to show that there's a disagreement between the king and Parliament and the Americans. Also, the British attempted to end smuggling. This had really started back around 1761. The French and Indian War was still ongoing, and the British wanted to stop the Americans from trading illegally with the French. But also, the British wanted the Americans to start paying taxes like they were supposed to. Remember, I told you the other day that on paper, the Navigation Act strictly controlled American trade, and there was a Molasses Act from 1733 that taxed the importation of sugar or molasses from the West Indies, but the Americans just basically ignored it. But now the British are tired of that, and they want the Americans to start paying these taxes in reality. So the idea they came up with to enforce the taxes and crack down on smugglers is they would use writs of assistance. First they sent the British Navy to capture colonial smugglers. And to the Americans, you might think in hindsight, well, a lot of these Americans are breaking the law. But in their eyes, they were doing what they had been doing for years and built businesses and lifestyles. And with the Navy now cracking down on them, they think, wait a second, it feels like we're being treated like we're now the enemy of the British people, just like the French were a few years earlier. And the British began using writs of assistance to enforce the Navigation Acts and to crack down on smuggling. Here's what you have to understand. The writs of assistance were general search warrants that allowed British officials to search colonial homes, buildings, and ships for smuggled goods. They did not specify the place or type of goods searched for, but allowed any official to search any place he wanted and seize any smuggled goods. So if I was a British customs official, I would apply to a judge for the writ of assistance. And it was basically a card or a permit that allowed me to go wherever I wanted. I could go into your home, I could go into your ship, I could go into your office. I didn't need to tell you when I was going to do the search or what I was searching for. I could just ransack your private and professional dwellings to my heart's content until I found something that was illegal and that I could punish you for. Now, here in America today, we do not have any such writs because we hated them so much in the 1760s. We wrote it into our Constitution that that's not permissible. But this is what the British were doing. The Americans were outraged, and in a case called Paxton's case in Boston, a Boston lawyer named James Otis Jr. argued that the writs were unconstitutional. Now, excuse me, Otis said everyone with this writ may be a tyrant. So everyone who has this in his hands can behave like a dictator, behave like a tyrant, right? And then he said, now one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedom of one's house. A man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege. He's claiming that there's this ancient doctrine or idea that as long as you have not done something to call a suspicion upon yourself, you should be free in your own home from being bothered. And obviously the writs of assistance don't. They violate that principle. He also called the Navigation Acts unenforceable and unconstitutional. He said if the King of Great Britain and person were encamped on Boston Common, that's a common, like a park area in the center of Boston, at the head of 20,000 men with all his navy on our coast, he would not be able to execute these laws. They would be resisted or eluded. He criticized the Molasses Act. This was the 1733 tax. He said it was enacted by a foreign legislature without our consent and by a legislature who had no feeling for us and whose interests prompted them to tax us to the quick. And he said that the writs of assistance were unconstitutional. He said even though they were authorized by Parliament, an act against the Constitution is void. An act against natural equity is void. And if an act of Parliament should be made in the very words of this petition, it would be void. And then he said, taxation without representation is tyranny. So he's expressing all of the ideas that are at the heart of the disagreement between the Americans and the British. Notice he says an act of Parliament is void when it is against the Constitution. To Americans, that made perfect sense. Americans had already begun to think that the Constitution is contained unwritten rights, like the right to be free from unjust searches and seizures, and Parliament could not violate those rights. And if it did, it was void. In England, they thought that just was nonsense. That didn't make any sense at all to them. Anything Parliament does is by definition constitutional. So to say it's void or unconstitutional didn't make any sense to them. John Adams was a lawyer. He was young. He was maybe 30 at the most. He was watching this trial. He watched James Otis speak for 5 hours, railing against Parliament and the writs of assistance and the Navigation Act. And he claimed many years later that this was the moment that the American Revolution began. He said, then and there, the child independence was born. One last thing, just because it's interesting. James Otis Jr. is a mostly forgotten person, even though he coined some famous phrases early in the rebellious years. By the 1770s and 1780s, he had mostly disappeared because he kind of went crazy. And so his sister, Mercy Otis Warren, I mentioned to you the other day, she was a prominent anti-federalist patriot during the American Revolution. She was a great historian and author. But he kind of disappeared. But before his mental health went bad and he disappeared from public view, he told his sister something that I thought was very interesting. He predicted, or he told her how he wished he would die when the time came. He said, "My dear sister, I hope when God Almighty in his righteous providence shall take me out of time into eternity, that it will be by a flash of lightning." Well, just by coincidence, in 1783, the year that America formally became independent from Great Britain, there was a storm in Boston, and he went to stand on his doorstep to watch the storm in the distance, and a lightning bolt struck him dead. So he got exactly what he wanted. Kind of interesting. So the rebelliousness continued. The Liberty Affair was about smuggling and British attempts to crack down on it. John Hancock was the wealthiest man in the American colonies, and he was the owner of a ship called Liberty, and he was a smuggler. And in 1768, British officials confiscated his ship, the Liberty. The reason they did is that earlier, a customs official had boarded the ship to search for smuggled wine, and the ship captain had locked him in the cabin and left him there for hours while they secretly unloaded all the smuggled goods. And so he went back and told the soldiers what had happened, and they confiscated the whole ship. When they took the ship, an angry mob went to the customs office and knocked the windows out of it, went to the home of the customs official, and threw things at the home and broke windows at his home. And many of the officials had to flee the city. Hancock was accused in court of smuggling over the incident. He was defended by John Adams, and he was acquitted. The ship was taken to Rhode Island, and it was used there by the British Navy to search for smugglers until one day in 1769, an angry mob of Rhode Islanders burned the ship to the ground, or to the sea, I guess I should say. Now, the British were alarmed over the whole incident, the mobs chasing the inspectors out of the city, and so forth. So they decided to send 4,000 British soldiers, nicknamed Redcoats, to Boston to protect customs officials from mobs. While all this was going, the British were doing other things that were troubling Americans. In 1764, they passed the Currency Act. It prohibited the colonies from printing paper money, which they had been doing for many years, and demanded that they pay their debts to British merchants in gold and silver, or in a commodity like tobacco. Because of this law, the British currency, the colonial currency, which looked like this. This was $1 from New York, the colony of New York. The value of that currency plummeted, and the economic fortunes of many Americans were hurt. In fact, it caused something of a depression in the American colonies. Another thing the British did during this time period that angered and upset Americans was the Quartering Act. This act required that colonists feed and house British soldiers at the colonists' expense. The soldiers were stationed in Boston and New York, and the Americans were offended by the act, and they asked, why are there soldiers in Boston and New York? Who's the enemy here? In other words, the French were gone, and the Indians were over on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. So if there are soldiers in Boston and New York, y'all must think we are the enemy, and they must be here to intimidate us, was the conclusion that the Americans came to. The British began to tax the Americans directly with the Sugar Act. This cut the tax on molasses in half, the old 1733 tax, but simultaneously imposed new taxes on sugar, wines, coffee, and spices. And the goal was to make Americans buy imported molasses from Britain rather than smuggle it from the West Indies, which belonged to the French. It was an inefficient tax. It cost Great Britain 4 times as much money to enforce the Sugar Act than it generated in revenue. This was the first time Parliament tried to raise tax revenue from the colonies rather than merely regulate their trade, and Americans protested that it was inconsistent with their rights and privileges as British subjects. James Otis said the act deprived Americans of the right of assessing their own taxes, and that taxation without representation is tyranny. Now notice the principle. They were being directly taxed by Parliament, whereas they thought that was a privilege that their colonial governments had only them. The British followed up the next year with a Stamp Act. This was a tax on all printed matter. What you had to do is you had to buy these stamps, and they would have to be affixed to letters, wills, deeds, marriage licenses, any kind of legal document, or any kind of document that circulated. And like the Sugar Act from 1764, this was a direct tax on the colonists. It was not a regulation of international trade. It was a direct tax on the colonists that affected all of them, whether they were merchants or lawyers or whatever. The colonists were outraged. One colonist named William Smith of New York said, "This single stroke has lost Great Britain the affection of all her colonies." Americans began calling themselves, or organizing groups called the Sons of Liberty, and these groups organized protests throughout the colonies. They signed boycott agreements or non-importation agreements, where they promised to boycott British goods. Women formed groups called Daughters of Liberty, and they stopped buying British clothes. In Virginia, a guy named Patrick Henry introduced a series of resolutions criticizing the Stamp Act. The 5th resolution had interesting language. He called the Stamp Act illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust, and said it has a manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American liberty. Colonies got together for the first time since the Albany Congress. In October of 1765, 10 colonies sent representatives to Boston, and they published a declaration of the rights and grievances of the colonies. They said that no taxes should be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. In some places, the protests were more than just verbal. A mob destroyed the homes of 2 British officials. And the outrage, and in some places the violence, was so great in America that by November the 1st of 1765, when the tax was supposed to go into effect, all of the officials in America who were in charge of enforcing the tax had resigned. So it never actually went into effect in America. It was so unpopular. There was no one here who would even carry out the tax. And the British repealed it. In February of 1766, they realized it was hopeless. It was just unenforceable. The opposition to it was too great. But when they repealed it in 1766, they also passed an act called the Declaratory Act, which asserted the power of Parliament to rule over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And then in 1767, they passed something called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts taxed glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And more importantly, one of the acts shut down the colonial government in New York. The reason it did was the government in New York had refused to pay for the quartering of soldiers. It was disobeying the 1765 law. And so Parliament punished New York by shutting down its government. This alarmed many Americans. In Boston, you had Otis, who was still around, and Samuel Adams, the cousin of John Adams. They wrote a letter, and the letter circulated to other states. And the letter argued that the Townshend taxes were illegal. When Parliament got wind of the letter, they ordered the Massachusetts legislature to withdraw it. In other words, to stop circulating it among other states, other colonies. Massachusetts refused, and the king ordered the Massachusetts Assembly to be dissolved. Meanwhile, many Americans continued to boycott British goods. So all of that led up to the first instance of, well, I guess you could say the mobs were violent, but the first real notable confrontation between the British soldiers and Americans, and that's the Boston Massacre. This engraving was made by Paul Revere, who wasn't there. And I'll tell you a little bit about the story. So what happened was, it was March the 5th, 1770. The soldiers were stationed outside the customs house, that's the tax collector's house. And a mob gathered and began throwing things at the soldiers and yelling and screaming at them. They threw snowballs, they threw rocks, and eventually they threw clubs, big sticks, like baseball bat size stuff. According to this account, which was made by Revere and which deliberately distorts the truth, the crowd is over here, and I know it's far away from you, so you can't see it too well, but you'll notice none of them are holding clubs. We know from eyewitness accounts that they had sticks the size of baseball bats in their hands, many of them, if not most. But they're just kind of standing there. The British are in a line, and their leader, who I think his name was Prescott, is behind them. His arm is raised, he's holding his sword high up in the air. What's that suggest that he's doing? His body language. Yes, he's ordering them to fire, right? That's what the body language suggests. That's not what happened. They did fire, and at least one American died. His name was Crispus Attucks. He was a free black man. He had once been a slave. Now he was living in Boston. Excuse me, 5 were killed. One of them was Crispus Attucks. 8 more were injured. So they did open fire. They did kill 5 people and injure several. And they were arrested. They were charged with murder. And John Adams agreed to represent them in court, which made him briefly the most unpopular man in Boston. They thought he was trying to help murderers get away with killing innocent people. But through his investigations and through the trial, he showed that this popular account made by Paul Revere and his own cousin Samuel Adams, they kind of made this account together, that it was a lie. It distorted the truth. What really happened was they were throwing rocks and snowballs and clubs at the British soldiers. The soldiers were in a line outside of the customs office, but Prescott was between the soldiers in the crowd, facing the soldiers, and instead of telling them fire, he was facing his soldiers and saying, don't fire, don't fire. But then one of the Americans threw one of those sticks, hit one of the British soldiers in the head. The soldier fell unconscious. The other soldiers panicked and started shooting. And so Adams was able to convince a Boston jury that this was self-defense, and they were all acquitted of the trial of the charge of murder. I think it's an interesting story. It shows you different things. Adams was really proud. For years afterwards, he said, even when we hated the British and considered them our enemies, we gave them a fair trial. And the jury acquitted them of the charge once it knew the real facts. But it also shows you how much the two sides hated each other now, right? The soldiers and the Americans saw each other as an enemy. The Americans saw the soldiers as a foreign power, there to colonize them and oppress them. In 1772, a British ship ran aground, meaning it kind of got stuck on rocks on the shore off of Rhode Island. Sailors from the ship went ashore and stole sheep, hogs, and chickens from the mainland. The colonists retaliated by boarding the ship, shooting its captain, and setting the ship on fire. After this, the British started threatening to take Americans who were suspected of crimes to London and to try them there for their crimes, meaning they didn't trust American juries, right, to give justice. In 1773, the famous Tea Party happened. You've surely heard about this in elementary school or high school or whatever. But what happened here is the British made a tax, a new tax, a Tea Act in 1773, and it cut the taxes on tea dramatically. And the reason it did was it wanted to undercut the price of smuggled tea from the Dutch West Indies. Americans like Samuel Adams and John Hancock were smuggling that tea into Boston and making a living by doing it. So the Americans thought, okay, this is tricky. What they're trying to do is ruin the jobs of the smugglers, but also trick us into paying a tax that we don't think is a legal tax, right? We don't think Parliament has the authority to tax us, but by cutting the tax, they think, aha, we'll trick those Americans into paying it anyway, because now it lowers their prices. So Americans, like the Sons of Liberty, refused to let the British tea company's tea be unloaded from the ships in Boston, Charleston, other cities in North America. And there was a standoff in Boston. The governor of Massachusetts, ordered the ship's captain to stay in the harbor and not go back to England. But the Sons of Liberty wouldn't let them unload the tea onto the shore. And for several days there was this standoff, and then the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Indians, as Mohawks, boarded the ship, took all of the tea, and threw it into the harbor. Interestingly, they didn't steal a single thing. They weren't there, and there were very strict rules. I think they caught one man stealing, and to punish him, they stripped him and made him walk home naked, because they wanted it to be clear that it was a political protest, not just theft, right? But the British were furious, and they decided to make an example out of these Americans. The British passed what were called the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts. King George III said, the colonists must either submit or triumph, meaning he was ready now for a showdown. They closed the port of Boston until the city agreed to pay for all the tea that had been thrown in the harbor. They took away the Massachusetts charter, closed its government, and put the colony under martial law, military rule. They said there could be no town meetings anywhere in Boston without military permission. They also authorized colonial governments governors to quarter troops in unoccupied buildings, and they allowed the transfer to England or another part of the empire trials of British officials charged with a crime in America. So if a British official shot and killed an American, the murder trial would be held in London, not in America. There was reaction to the laws. Richard Henry Lee was a Virginian. He said, "This is a most wicked system for destroying the liberty of America." George Washington called the one about transferring criminal trials to London the Murder Act, because he thought it would have let British soldiers get away with murder. Thomas Jefferson called for declaring a day of prayer and fasting in Virginia to mourn the passage of this law. Edmund Burke, who was not an American, he was an Englishman, or he was an Irishman, Englishman, something like that. He was a conservative in Parliament. He thought this was a terrible law, or series of laws. He said, "This is the day then that you wish to go to war with all America." In other words, he predicted accurately that there was no going back. This would push the Americans into war. In Virginia, delegates decided to form a Continental Congress to represent all of the colonies to coordinate a response to these laws. So the First Continental Congress met in 1774 in Virginia. They endorsed something called the Suffolk Reserves, which denounced the abolition of the Massachusetts government and urged a boycott of goods from Britain. They sent a petition to the king asking for the repeal of the Coercive Acts. They signed a Declaration of Rights, also known as the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. And it said that Americans had all the same rights as British citizens and denied Parliament's authority to regulate internal colonial affairs. They created something called the Continental Association, which organized a boycott of all imported British goods. And last, they recommended that the colonists begin making military preparations for defense against the British soldiers. The British in 1775, under a prime minister called Lord North, realized that things had now gone too far and that they were on the verge of a war that they didn't really want. So Prime Minister Lord North signed or agreed to the conciliatory propositions. I've also seen it called the conciliatory resolution. They offered to eliminate all taxes on any colony that volunteered to tax itself, to pay for its military defense and the salaries of its royal governors. This would have given the Americans most of what they wanted, right? The right to tax themselves exclusively and not have Parliament tax them. But it got to America too late. By the time the resolutions reached the colonies, war had already begun. In 1775, on March 23, the colonists were preparing for war. Remember, the resolution still hadn't arrived yet. Patrick Henry gave a famous speech urging Virginia to prepare for war. He said it was too late for compromise, and the only choice left for Virginia was to submit to Parliament or to fight. And he closed with famous lines. He said, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others might take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." The war began in Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts on April 19, 1775. What happened was, remember, Massachusetts is under military rule. The guy in charge of the military in Boston decided to send 700 soldiers to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock and to seize weapons that the Americans were storing at Lexington and Concord. The soldiers left at midnight. They marched about, a dozen, 15 miles, something like that, to Lexington. When they got there, word had reached Lexington that the British were on their way because of Paul Revere and Samuel Dawes and others. The American militia was formed up. The Minutemen were lined up in the center of the town waiting for them. We don't know who fired the first shot, but someone fired a shot, and then gunfire broke out, and by the time it was over, 8 Americans were dead, and several more were wounded. The British then marched on to Concord, where they thought Samuel Adams and John Hancock were, but those two had already disappeared. They had had plenty of warning, and the weapons that the British were searching for had already been safely moved away and hidden. They fought more Minutemen at a place called the North Bridge, just outside of Concord. An American, began ringing church bells, and thousands of American Minutemen began descending upon Concord from the surrounding towns, the surrounding farms. They chased the British soldiers all the way back to Boston. At this point, it was about a 15 or 16 mile march. Notice the British had already marched from that night, midnight, about 15 miles or so to Lexington and Concord. They'd fought 2 battles, and then they were chased about 15 miles back, and people were shooting at them the whole way back from the trees and the stones along the route. So it turned into a rout and a nightmare for the British. It was not an auspicious beginning for them for the war. In fact, they suffered 3 times as many casualties as the Americans did in all of the fighting. And that was it. The war was underway, and that's where we'll stop for today.